In 1939, things had gotten really bad for the Jews of Germany. Alex Goldschmidt and his teenage son, along with over 900 other Jews, boarded the luxury liner the St. Louis in Germany. Their destination was Cuba. Once they got to the harbor in Havana, the Cuban government changed their minds and decided to not let them in. They sailed up to the U.S. The answer was no. Then they tried Canada. In the end, the ship turned back to Europe. Alex and his son ended up spending a few years in different internment camps in France. They were eventually shipped off to Auschwitz and murdered by the Nazis. Martin Goldsmith is Alex's grandson. He took a journey that retraces the last years of his grandfather and uncle's lives. His book is called Alex's Wake, and Martin Goldsmith joins me in the studio. Martin, welcome.
Great to be with you, Mimi. Thank you.
It wasn't just your grandfather and Uncle Helmut who were murdered by the Nazis. What happened to the rest of your family?
My father's mother and my father's younger sister were deported in 1942 to the ghetto in Riga, where they were murdered. My father's grandmother was murdered in the concentration camp Theresienstadt, or Terezin, and my mother's mother was murdered in the camp Travnitsky. So my family was pretty well decimated by the Nazis.
So your grandfather, Alex, he was murdered, his wife was murdered. They had 4 children.
Right.
And of those 4, your father obviously survived.
Right.
The other 3 were killed?
No, my father's elder sister managed to emigrate to England, and she
survived.
She survived. But my father's younger brother and younger sister were both murdered.
What did your parents tell you as a kid about your extended family?
Very little. As I understand it, that's not too unusual for people in their situation. They managed to survive as long as they did in Nazi Germany, and then emigrate to this country in 1941 because they were musicians performing in this extraordinary organization called the Jüdischer Kulturbund, the Jewish Cultural Association, something I wrote about in my first book, The Inextinguishable Symphony. So they managed to survive, make it to this country in 1941. By that time, my Uncle Helmut and my grandfather Alex were in these internment camps in France and wrote a series of desperate letters to my father, who was safely in America, and the letters had a recurring theme: please do whatever you can to get us out of here. My parents were obviously new immigrants to this country. They had menial jobs bringing in about $26 a week. They had very few resources, very few connections, so they were really unable to do very much, but it probably, in all fairness, is true that they didn't do everything they possibly could have done. So I'm sure they were...
Your grandfather writes this letter saying, you have got to move heaven and earth to get us out of here. Our situation is desperate. Mm-hmm. And if you don't, it'll be on your conscience.
Exactly. Which
that wasn't really fair.
Well, certainly from the perspective of my grandfather at the time, it's totally understandable when you realize the hell he was going through and his younger son, my father's younger brother, were going through. But sure, from the safe remove of 70 years, it's possible to say that's a pretty heavy thing to leave my father, and it certainly had its effect. I'm sure my father carried this great burden of guilt with him for the rest of his life.
How could you tell? How could you tell how it was affecting him if he didn't really talk about it?
Well, the very fact that he didn't talk about it, I think, is a certain piece of evidence. My older brother at one point very pointedly said to my father, how come we don't have grandparents? How come we can't go over the river and through the woods at Thanksgiving to visit them? What happened to our family? And my father said very shortly, they died in the war. And that was it. And he was always very uncomfortable talking about what had happened.
Do you feel that his guilt trickled down to you in some way?
There's no question about it. As I write in the book, for some years, I had been aware of this rhetorical question that I would ask myself: how can I be happy? How do I deserve happiness? Do I deserve happiness when my grandfather was murdered in Auschwitz. Even though he was murdered 10 years before I was born, I obviously had nothing to do with it. I couldn't have done anything to save my grandfather and uncle, and yet I think the guilt that my father felt, he unwittingly and unknowingly passed on to me as my emotional heritage.
But was it that guilt of my family's dead, or was it I could have done something? I should have tried everything and I didn't.
Well,
did you talk to him about it before his death?
Briefly, yes. My father was afflicted with Alzheimer's in his last years, and we had a number of actually very nice conversations, though most of them were centered very far back in the past. But he did acknowledge that he probably could have done more, and that was the source of his guilt. The source of my guilt was a lot more amorphous because, again, they were murdered 10 years before I was born. But I was aware when I conceived of this journey that I took with my wife 3 years ago through Germany and France and ultimately into the Polish town of Oswiecim, or Auschwitz in German. I was aware of an irrational desire to save my grandfather and my uncle, again, even though they had died 10 years before I was born.
The book we're discussing is called Alex's Wake, A Voyage of Betrayal and a Journey of Remembrance. Martin Goldsmith is an author. He's also host of Symphony Hall on Sirius XM Radio. I was going to ask you about that trip. Where did you get the idea to retrace their steps?
I first decided that I wanted to write another book about my family when my father died at age 95 of Alzheimer's. And then less than a year later, my brother, my only sibling, was felled by a heart attack. So I found myself the last Goldsmith standing. And I think as a way of coming to terms with my grief, I decided to write another book about my family. And I realized that I had had this very deep interest in what happened to grandfather Alex and my uncle Helmut. And I began doing research at the Holocaust Museum here in Washington to find out more about what had happened to them, because I knew that they spent time in the French camps of Rivesaltes and Les Milles, but they entered Rivesaltes in January of 1941. They arrived back in France on the St. Louis in June of 1939. So there was that 18-month gap. And it occurred to me late one night that what I really had to do was to retrace their steps, to try to lay flowers on their graves.
Is that what you were trying to accomplish?
It was, irrational as it seemed, that somehow I thought that I could save them by going through this journey. And on a more practical level, to find more details of their 3-year odyssey through France so that I would be able to set it down in this book.
You say that in taking this trip, it was, quote, if not to save my grandfather and uncle, perhaps to save myself. Save yourself from what?
From this, and I don't mean to make this sound more debilitating than it was, but this somewhat emotionally crippling legacy, family legacy of guilt and shame and sorrow. I realized that I had been swimming in Alex's wake for most of my life, and I thought that perhaps by taking this journey, I would be able to, again, place flowers on their graves and to free myself from this burden so that I could emerge from the turbulence of Alex's wake to the more peaceful waters of my family and my friends and my life.
Tell us about your grandfather, Alex Goldschmidt.
He was born in 1879 in a little village in Lower Saxony, Germany, called Sachsenhagen. He was one of 8 children. His father and his grandfather had both been horse breeders and horse sellers, an occupation that was open to the Jews of Europe. Not all professions were. My great-grandfather Moses and my great-great-grandfather Levi Goldschmidt had done quite well for themselves as horse breeders. But Alex, my grandfather, decided he wanted to have nothing to do with the horse business, and he went to the somewhat larger city of Oldenburg in the northwestern part of Germany, where he opened up a women's clothing store called the Haus der Mode, the House of Fashion. And then he went off and fought in the First World War on the German side, naturally enough. He was awarded the Iron Cross First Class. He returned from the fighting miraculously unwounded in 1919, went back to the Haus der Mode, which did exceedingly well for itself, and he became rather a pillar of the community.
What was the first sign of trouble for your family?
Well, the first sign was the fact that Oldenburg, both the city of Oldenburg and the state of Oldenburg, was the first part of Germany to elect a Nazi government. This was in the autumn of 1932, several months before Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933.
And is that because Oldenburg was just more anti-Semitic, or what was the appeal of the Nazi Party for them?
Well, the Nazi Party, of course, made inroads in all strata of German life eventually, but they began life as appealing to rural interests, and Oldenburg is a rural state, or certainly was back then. But of course, they also appealed to German pride and the fact that the country had been stabbed in the back by the November criminals, those people who authored the surrender in 1918 and who agreed to the crippling Treaty of Versailles ending the First World War. So there were all these nationalistic appeals, and for whatever reason, the state of Oldenburg, as I say, was the first part of Germany to elect a Nazi government in 1932. So towards the very end of 1932, a couple of Nazi officials knocked on the door of my grandfather's house on Gartenstrasse and said, "It is not right for a Jew to be able to own this marvelous house. You must sell it for 26,000 marks, which works out to about $10,400 for a house that today is certainly worth anywhere from $3 to $5 to $10 million. So my grandfather was forced to sell this beautiful house at rock-bottom prices.
He was also forced to shut down his business.
Well, shortly after Hitler became chancellor in January of 1933, there was the infamous boycott of Jewish businesses on April 1st, 1933. That had a significant effect on my grandfather's business, and certainly over the next 5 years, business went downhill rapidly.
Author Martin Goldsmith is in the studio with me. We're discussing his book called Alex's Wake, A Voyage of Betrayal and a Journey of Remembrance. Why was he arrested and sent to a camp that very first time?
He was arrested along with literally thousands of other Jews across the country on the infamous date of November 9th, 1938, remembered as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when Nazi thugs roamed Germany from border to border, smashing the windows of Jewish-owned businesses, ransacking synagogues, setting synagogues on fire, dragging Jews into the streets, stomping them sometimes to death, and tens of thousands of Jews were arrested, among them grandfather Alex. He was arrested on the night of November 9th, brought to the Pferdemarkt, the horse market in Oldenburg.
Even though they were the victims, they were arrested.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the next morning, he and 42 other adult Jews of Oldenburg were paraded through the streets of the city past the smoldering remains of the synagogue on Peterstrasse. They spent a night in the Oldenburg prison, and then the next day were again marched through the streets to the train station. They were put on trains heading east to the concentration camp Sachsenhausen, where my grandfather stayed for the next month or so. He was then released in early December of 1938 and told, you have 6 months to leave the country or else face further arrest.
And that's when he said, we've got to get out of this country. This is not going to work out for us. Why did he think of Cuba?
Well, he had to go somewhere, and he learned of the existence of this refugee ship called the St. Louis, the pride of the Hamburg-America line. And an interesting confluence of events led to this luxury liner transporting 937 Jewish refugees out of Germany. This was one of the interim solutions to what was called the Jewish problem. Of course, the final solution was still several years in the future, but in May of 1939, one of these interim solutions was just to boot as many Jews out of the country as possible. The Hamburg-America line had fallen on recent financial hard times, And so the Nazis who controlled this Hamburg America line came up with this brilliant idea of having the Jews pay full freight, either a first-class or second-class tickets. They would leave the country, which was what the Nazis wanted. The German-America line would make a nice profit on this journey, and the Jews themselves would perhaps enjoy being booted out of the country in this most civilized of manners.
So what happened when they got to Havana? They had all their paperwork. They bought their visas or whatever they had to do.
Right.
Everything was in order.
Right.
They dock in Havana, and all of a sudden, no, you can't get off the ship?
Well, they learned that there is this power play going on in the upper reaches of the Cuban government. This fellow by the name of Manuel Benitez had sent a notice to all of the passengers on the St. Louis before they bought their tickets, or as they were buying their tickets: you need to purchase landing certificates from me in order to get off the boat in Havana. So everybody, including my grandfather and uncle, dutifully bought these Benitez landing certificates. Well, as it turned out, Senor Benitez was aligned with a fellow named Batista, who would later become the president of Cuba. But the president of Cuba in May of 1939 was a fellow by the name of Fulgencio Bru. And President Bru decided at this moment to say, well, I'm going to be the one who decides who gets off the boat. If you don't have my landing certificates, you are not able to disembark in
So couldn't they have
Havana.
just bought those landing certificates? I mean, this is just another way to swindle the Jews, but I mean, you got to do what you got to do.
Right. Well, at the time, President Bru said, if you don't have my certificates on you right now, you cannot get off the boat. Everything was further complicated by the well-meaning American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which sent a lawyer from New York down to Havana. This lawyer was named Lawrence Berenson. He fancied himself a wheeler dealer. He said, I've lived among the Cubans. I know the Cuban mind. And at the time, President Bru said, all right, if everybody on board the St. Louis pays the Cuban government a fee of $500, we will let them disembark. That came to $453,000. Lawrence Berenson thought to himself, aha, he's starting the negotiations. I will return with a lower bid. So Lawrence Berenson said, well, we will give you, instead of $453,000, $443,000. He wanted to save $10,000, or roughly $11 per passenger. President Bru said, I am not negotiating. I'm insulted by your assumption. Get out. So he ordered the St. Louis to leave Cuban waters the next day.
Okay, so we're just 90 miles away from the United States.
Right.
Why can't we just dock there?
The ship sailed north to the coast of Florida. The captain was a fellow by the name of Gustav Schroeder, and he radioed the American authorities, the U.S. State Department, President Roosevelt, for permission to land in Miami. But that permission was denied, ostensibly because the United States at the time was operating under the 1924 Immigration Act, which had quotas for the numbers of people who could...
But these are refugees, and they're right there.
They are right there.
And we know what the Germans would do to them. I mean, it was still early, but we still had an idea that they were not going to be treated well.
Well, certainly Kristallnacht, which again was now 6 months in the past, had been front page news in the United States. I mean, I have seen newspapers, I've seen the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Baltimore Sun, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, all of these major newspapers on the 10th and 11th and 12th of November 1938 with these big headlines showing what had happened to the Jews during Kristallnacht. Nevertheless, the beginning of the war was still several months off, and no one could really see over the next hill as to what would happen to the Jews during the so-called final solution.
Do you blame FDR personally for that decision?
Gosh, I for what it's worth, I got a degree in history in college, and I can't help but look at certain events both historically and personally. The historian in me realizes that Roosevelt did have a number of obstacles. He was supposedly trying to overturn the Neutrality Acts to help the European resistance to Nazism. And supposedly, if he had allowed the St. Louis to land, that would have cost him the support of several Southern Democratic senators. This country was quite anti-Semitic at the time. I uncovered some Roper polls which showed that a majority of Americans thought the Jews were not like the rest of us and didn't deserve the same rights and privileges as everybody. This was, of course, the time of restrictions. Jews were not allowed to check into certain hotels. They couldn't belong to a number of country clubs. So the country was fairly anti-Semitic as well. So President Roosevelt was, in many ways, just reflecting the mood of the country.
The book we're discussing is called Alex's Wake, A Voyage of Betrayal and a Journey of Remembrance. Martin Goldsmith is an author and host of Symphony Hall on Sirius XM Radio. So instead of going back to Germany, the passengers were split up. They went to various countries in Europe. Your grandfather and uncle were assigned to France, but some of them went to England. Did the ones that go to England survive in the end?
They did, yes. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, actually a fellow by the name of Morris Troper, brokered this deal whereby the refugees on board the St. Louis could, in fact, disembark in either England, France, Belgium, or Holland. Yes, those passengers who got off in England were, of course, safe from the Nazi invaders.
But everybody else eventually...
Well, everybody else was subject to the invasion of the Low Countries and France, which took place in the spring of 1940. And yes, my grandfather and uncle got off in France. They spent actually the first 2 months in France at this, what sounds like and what appeared to be, since I visited the little village, an idyllic place called Martigny-les-Bains, which is in the northeastern part of France. It had been a spa town for a number of years. It had healing waters, and there was a marvelous big hotel, the Hotel International, which at the very beginning of the 20th century was one of the destination points in all of Europe. They very proudly advertised electricity in all the rooms, and that hotel was later used as the place where my grandfather and uncle stayed for a couple of months. Martigny-les-Bains was termed an agricultural re-education center by the French, where these refugees could learn agricultural skills. My grandfather, who was a businessman and a former soldier, learned the art of chicken farming at Martigny-les-Bains, and my uncle Helmut learned how to raise sheep and plant vegetables. So during the summer months of July and August 1939, they spent time in this very idyllic place.
But that wasn't to last.
Right. Well, September
France
1st.
surrenders to Germany, and the Vichy government comes in. We know what they do. I mean, they voluntarily say, we're going to imprison these Jews. We're going to send them back east for extermination camps, even though they knew that's what they were sending them.
Well, on September 1st, 1939, the Second World War began, and within 10 days, the word went out that all German citizens living in France, Germany and France were now at war, were to be interned. And so Alex and Helmut were taken from Martigny-les-Bains to a camp called Sion, where they stayed for several months. Then, as you say, the Vichy government came in once the French had been quickly defeated by the German Blitzkrieg in the spring of 1940. The Vichy government was terribly right-wing, as anti-Semitic as the Nazis. The Nazis had passed the Nuremberg laws in September of 1935. Well, in October of 1940, the French Vichy government passed what they termed the Statut des Juifs, which was every bit as anti-Semitic as the Nuremberg laws. French Jews were declared non-citizens. They could not take part in various professions. They were subject to curfews, and so things became very, very difficult for the Jews of France.
This trip for you, when you went to all these different places, obviously was very emotional. And at one point, you say out loud to your grandfather and your uncle, "I miss you, I miss you." How could you miss them when you'd never met them?
Well, that's a very good metaphysical question, Mimi. I think what I missed was the opportunity to know them. But one of the wonderful things about this journey, this 6-week, 5,700-mile journey that my wife and I took, it was, as you say, very sad, but it was also exhilarating in many ways, because we were able to learn tantalizing bits about them, about my grandfather and uncle, both about physical aspects of them and how they lived, and also about their character.
The journey for both you and your grandfather and uncle ended in Auschwitz. What happened when they got off the train at that camp?
They were a part of Convoy 19, which left Drancy on the 16th of August, 1942. When they arrived on or about the 17th of August, 1942, my grandfather was immediately gassed. He was 63 years old, deemed too old to help in the labor camp. My uncle was tattooed with the number 59305, sent to Barracks 7 in Auschwitz. Within 2 months, however, he was transferred to Barracks 20, where he died on the 9th of October, 1942, age 21.
And what did you do when you got to Auschwitz?
I had brought along little photographs of my grandfather and uncle, photographs that they had taken as part of their visas to board the St. Louis, and I'd scotch-taped these photographs to a little space above the rear-view mirror in our car. So they were our constant companions as we traveled. And when we got to Auschwitz, I took down their photographs and set down the photograph of my uncle Helmut in Barracks 20, where he died, and the photograph of my grandfather Alex in the ruined subterranean part of the crematoria in Birkenau, where he was murdered. And I put little flowers, little wildflowers from a Birkenau field down in that place. And I did manage literally to lay flowers on what I determined at any rate to be my grandfather's and uncle's graves.
And at the end of this journey, Martin, did you let go of that guilt?
I did. I certainly tried to there in Auschwitz, and then there was a postscript to our 5,700-mile journey, which occurred in September of 2012, a little more than a year after we returned from our journey. The current owners of my grandfather's splendid house in Oldenburg decided to erect a plaque which says in German, in effect, this house was owned by the Jewish businessman Alex Goldschmidt. He and his son were murdered in Auschwitz. His wife and daughter were murdered in Riga. And then underneath there are 2 lines in English from a poem that I discovered, a poem by Emily Dickinson. The lines read, "Remembrance has a rear and front, 'tis something like a house." And having that plaque on the side of my grandfather's house did a great deal to enable me to set down that burden of guilt and shame. And I think I've been a happier man ever since.
The book is Alex's Wake, A Voyage of Betrayal and a Journey of Remembrance. Martin Goldsmith is an author and host of Symphony Hall on Sirius XM Radio. Martin, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you, Mimi, very much.